Hello, this video is about tanks. I hope you're interested in tanks because I'm going to be mentioning tanks really quite a lot. Now if you're a woman, the chances are very definitely that you're not interested in tanks, which I find odd because, how can this be the case? Now I admit, met a few women who have pretended to me that they were interested in tanks, but then when I quizzed them about, some of the finer points of detail of the design of the later variants of Sherman or something, it turned out that they knew nothing. They weren't into tanks at all. They were just pretending, I don't know, to please me or something, which is odd because, tanks, they're great, aren't they? I mean, they've got, great big thick armour, they're big and heavy things, and then, they've got big tracks and to tear up the countryside and boom across the countryside with a big engine, vroom, and you've got a crew of 4 or 5 men working together as a team, and you've got a turret with a big gun in it, and bang and war, and they've just got everything. Anyway, this video has been sponsored by the good folk at audible.com. More of that later. Now, I suppose it is, yes, genuinely a shame that we, mankind, has to design machines, great monsters that are tanks, to do the job that tanks do, but, hey, they're still tanks. Now, there is this persistent myth that in World War II, the French got rolled over real easily by the blitzkrieg of the Germans because the Germans had loads and loads of really big, high-tech, well-designed tanks, whereas the French tanks were few and just rubbish. This is not true. The French actually had slightly more tanks than the Germans, and the Germans only had as many tanks as they did because they'd nicked so many of them off the Czechoslovakians. Czechoslovakia, for its day, had a pretty good, pretty high-tech, up-to-date, well-trained army with good equipment and good tanks. They had, for instance, they had these, for instance. This is a 38T, or rather a model I made of one. And though by later war standards, it's a tiddly little tank. For its day, this was pretty handy, and the Germans used lots of them in the invasion of France in 1940, and then later in the invasion of Russia in Operation Barbarossa. Now, what did the French do wrong that made it possible for the Germans to just roll over them in the blitzkrieg? Because we all know, don't we, that the German tanks surged through France and trapped the Allies at Dunkirk really amazingly quickly, and it was all the battle for France in 1940 was all over embarrassingly quickly. Well, it wasn't because the French had too few tanks. No, they had loads of tanks. Now, admittedly, a lot of the tanks that the French had were a bit rubbish. They, for instance, were still using these things. This is a Renault FT17. This thing would go pug, 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 pug along at about 5.5 miles an hour if it was lucky. And yes, so you could actually outwalk one of these things. They were tiny, they had a crew of 2, they had one guy to drive it and one guy to do everything else, the little pop gun at the front. These were designed in 1917. This is a World War I design, though a very successful one. They sold them all around the world. They sold loads of them, for instance, to the Americans. And the Americans in 1939 aren't really in the tank race at all. They have no tanks to speak of, and almost all the tanks that the army actually is equipped with have been bought in from other countries. So the big nations that have tanks are the British and the French and the Germans and the Russians, and to a lesser extent the Italians. Now, the Germans didn't actually have loads and loads of enormous tanks. A lot of the German tanks were tiny. Look at this thing. This is a Panzer I. Okay, they were using these in the Spanish Civil War, but there's a tiddly little thing. Let me show you just how tiddly it is. Like this is a Panzer V, otherwise known as a Panther, and this is from later in the war. And just look, I mean, look at that. These are to the same scale. These are 1/76 scale, and just that these were tiddly little tanks. It doesn't even have a main gun. It's just got machine guns on it. So a lot of the German tanks were Panzer Is and Panzer II, again, fairly tiddly tank. And they weren't the great hulking beasts that we think like the King Tigers that came much later in the war. Yes, now so a lot of the French had slightly more up-to-date things like this. This is a Hotchkiss 35, but again this is still a light tank really. It's a tiddly little thing, decently armoured, decently fast by comparison with the FT17, but not really up to the task of taking on the main panzer units. Now a lot of people are familiar with the Panzer IV. Here is an unfinished model of a Panzer IV, and this is the Mark D, the one which was used in the invasion of France. It's unfinished, but it's largely scratch built by me, the conversion. See my website for details. Anyway, this you see has a short stubby gun on its turret. This was not for taking on other tanks, not at this stage in the war. At this point in the invasion of France, these things were support tanks. It had a low velocity howitzer in the turret for firing high explosive, for supporting the infantry. If they needed a tank for taking on other tanks, the tank they were using was the Panzer III. This was, if you like, what we today would call a main battle tank, but really the term main battle tank is a modern post-war thing and is inappropriate for World War II. And before some of you say, that's the wrong sort of Panzer III, that's the later version of the Panzer III, they weren't using them in the 1940s. Yes, I know. This is the later version with a 50mm gun, but never mind. The earlier version models have been on my painting table for the last 5 years or something, so they're waiting. So this is the only one I had to show you. But the Panzer III is the main thing that the Germans were using. And the French equivalent of the Panzer III was probably something like this, the Saumur 35. Now the Saumur 35 was faster than the Panzer III, had better armour, thicker, stronger, better sloped armour than the Panzer III, and a more powerful, bigger gun than the Panzer III. So in terms of the main three stats, if you like, speed, armour and gun, the French equivalent was actually better. And why didn't these do spectacularly well? Well, the main reason is the way they were deployed. They were high-tech. I should just say a few more things about this. I mean, they had cast turrets and cast hulls, which was expensive, but very good for its day and rare. And the top of the hull was just bolted to the bottom of the hull, and sometimes they apparently, when they got hit by something really big, would split along the bolts would burst and the two halves would fall apart. And sometimes these were reported as ringing like a bell when they were hit, ding, because of these massive cast slabs of metal. But anyway, they had self-sealing fuel tanks and they had automatic fire extinguishing mechanisms within them. They were high tech for their day. They were also very difficult to repair. But anyway, enough of the details. The point is they were actually decent tanks. And they were deployed badly, though. What the French tended to do was put a few tanks there, a few tanks there, a few tanks there, a few tanks there, along the line defensively, using them like mobile pillboxes. Wasn't very clever, because what the attacker can do is put all his tanks into one enormous great unit and crash forwards with that. So wherever it does hit, and this is an advantage the attacker has, he gets to pick where the attack comes. The Blitzkrieg then had loads and loads of tanks which massively outnumbered the French in that particular point of the battlefield. So they were able to puncture the French line and keep going. Well, that was the Blitzkrieg, and it was all over very, very quickly. So the French tanks were beaten, if you like, strategically, but tactically, when they did have what you might call a fair fight, they did actually pretty well. A lot of the French tanks were immune to the main guns of the Germans. Now, another tank they had was this, the Char 1B bis. And this was originally designed to fire that big howitzer. You see there's a howitzer in the hull, but they thought, oh, we better stick a turret on it. And can you see that's the same turret that the Saumur has? Quite a small thing, 47mm gun, which for its day was a decent gun. One of these got into a fight with a load of German tanks and was hit 140 times and suffered no ill effects, knocked out loads of German tanks, and then was able to retreat unharmed. It had really thick armour. The French had good tanks. The British had the Matilda II, which was also immune to the standard anti-tank guns that the Germans were using at the day. So the idea that the Germans rolled over the French because they had more tanks is wrong, or that they had better tanks is wrong, or that they had bigger tanks is wrong. It's really the strategic situation which made the Blitzkrieg so effective. But there was another issue, which is something I really want to talk about, and that is the one-man turret. You see, the turret that you see on the French tank is very small. Small turrets are good, because a small turret is difficult to hit because it's small, it's difficult to see because it's small, it's easy to camouflage because it's small, and you can armour it very thickly, because if you imagine, if you want thick armour on a very large turret, that weighs a huge amount, which then slows everything down. The engine then has to power a much heavier machine, and you're in trouble from the off. Whereas if you have a small turret, you can have a cast thick turret and it's still going to work and not be too heavy and slow you down. So a one-man turret was a very tempting thing to have. It also means that you can keep the number of crew down, and that means you've got fewer eggs in the basket. If you've got a 5-man crew in a tank and that tank then gets knocked out, that's 5 men who are all at risk of injury, and even if they all walk away alive from that tank, that's 5 crew members have now lost their weapon, they're now useless, they're taken out of the battle. So having a smaller number of men in the tank is very tempting. But the Germans had tanks with much bigger turrets, and they had, in the case of the Panzer III, 3-man crews, and that makes a big difference tactically. So I want you to imagine that you are a French commander and you're in something like this. Now the commander, you can see there's a hatch at the back of the turret and he's sitting on that, and from there he's out in the open and he can see what's going on. There is I never know quite how to say it, a cupola, the thing on the top of the turret there, which has some vision slits in it, which you can see out a bit, but you really can't see very well out of one of those. If you want a decent view of the landscape, you get up out of the turret so that you can see the landscape, all of it around you, use both your eyes, use your binoculars and so forth. And the cupola in a French tank, those French tanks had no hatch, so you had to open the back of the turret and climb out and sit on the hatch to look about you. So there you are commanding the tank. You are also the gunner and the loader of that gun. And you're in a defensive position, looking round, and oh, sacre bleu, oh, what's this? You think you see a German tank, so you get your binoculars, and yes, it is a German tank. Okay, right, you can't now give orders to anyone. You have to then get into your turret and shut the thing. And right, so you need to load, open the breech, in with armor piercing, because you know you need an armor piercing thing. And then you put your eye to the telescope of your gun sight. Now that's a telescopic thing which shows you just a tiny bit of the landscape. You're seeing just this much of the world out there magnified in front of you with your reticule on for aiming the gun. So you look at that and you're very unlikely to be pointing straight at that enemy tank. So where is it? So you now have to try to find it. Where is it again? Where? Hang on. So you get out. Right. Okay, so there's the barn, 3 poplar trees to the right, just a little bit behind it. Okay, got it. Right, so back in, and now you find it. Now, let's imagine that you've been really lucky and in all that time, it has not moved. Okay, you then get off a shot. Bang! But you're quite likely to miss with your first shot, particularly as you might not get an accurate estimate of range to the target. And that's the single factor that most affects whether a target is hit or not with the first shot. Do you have an accurate estimate of the range to the target? So perhaps you missed, so that a load of smoke goes forwards, and where is it? Where's the tank? And you're now working the controls, looking around, trying to find that tank, and you can't find the tank. So open the thing again. Where is the there? It's moving. It's coming forwards. It's coming down the hill. Okay, right. So go back in, and now you've got to open the breech, and you've got to put on your thick glove to take out the incredibly hot shell casing, drop that, and then get another one, shove that in, close the breech, look, and it's hopeless. Where is it? Where is it? I can't sit and back out, and it's gone. So that's what happens when you've got a one-man turret. You're trying to acquire the target, you're trying to estimate a range to the target, you're trying to then get the gun onto that target. You've then got to load the gun, and you need a thick glove to handle the shell casings, and you might not be wanting to wear that thick glove when you're operating the fine controls for the gunnery, and then it's not easy to pick up your binoculars with a big loader's glove either, so you're perhaps taking the loader's glove off and putting it back on again all the time, and you've got to keep taking your eye away from the gun sight in order to get your shells to load in, go out the back, look through the binoculars. This is a problem. you've also got to try to command your tank, because there's a driver that you might want to talk to. You might want to move the tank, and if you're in command of a troop of tanks, you're supposed to be commanding them as well and talking to them and getting on the radio and giving them instructions all at the same time. It's too much for one guy. Now, imagine instead you are in one of these. This is a Churchill tank, a late war tank. It's British, and this had a 3-man turret. And I want you to notice that in front of the commander there, can you see the red thing sticking up? That is the commander's gun sight. And it gives a rough but useful indication of range, and it also gives a very accurate and very useful indication of the line that the turret is pointing along. So the situation is the same, only this time you have a hatch in the top of the turret, so you pop out the top. Getting in and out of your turret is much quicker and easier with a turret hatch on the top, and you can communicate with your crewman if you're a German commander through a throat mic, and if you're a British one they tended to have a little handheld thing, but you can talk directly into the earphones of the rest of your crew, so it doesn't matter how much noise the engine is making, whether explosions going off, they will hear you. So you've also got another guy to handle operating the radio, which is pretty handy. So you can then notice your target. Aha! German tank. Right, and immediately you can start giving orders. Right, loader, load, armor piercing, gunner traverse right. And the gunner will then start traversing right. And you will look down your commander's sight until you can see that the turret is pointing in the right direction, at which point you say on. The gunner then stops traversing the turret, and he will now be able to see, all going well, the target through his gun sight. And he will then make the fine adjustments to put the reticle right on that, according to the range estimate that you give him, 600 yards. So he then takes your word for it, and bang, you got one shot off already, far faster than you would have been able to achieve with the 1-man turret. And then the loader, who is ready with the next shell, can just slam that straight in. He's got the glove ready, close the breech. The gunner never had to take his eye off the reticule, and you're ready to get a second shot off. Bang! Okay, second shot goes off as well. So you've got a faster rate of fire and a more effective one. But let's imagine, nonetheless, that you've still managed to miss the target. The commander with his binoculars can be observing the fall of shot, and he can give you a more accurate estimate of range based on that. You realise, no, 750 yards, adjust, 750 yards. So you've now got a new and more accurate estimate of range, and that is the single fact that is most likely to put the shell onto target. But let's imagine that still you somehow managed to miss, or maybe you hit and it bounced off, whatever. The target then starts moving, the commander can then follow it, and he can give a running commentary on what the target's doing, and the gunner can follow it because he never has to take his eye off the gun sight, and the loader can get on with the business of loading and, if necessary, monitoring any incoming messages on the radio. And whilst all that's going on, the commander is also in a position to notice new targets and new threats appearing, which in a 1-man turret you never will. If you're down in an opaque iron box with your eye to a gun sight trying to deal with one target, you will never notice that new threat appearing from over there. But if you've got one guy out the top all the time looking for new threats, that will happen. So tactically, a 3-man turret is enormously more efficient than a 1-man turret. Now, I did say earlier that this was sponsored by audible.com, and it is. And audible.com is a big website which has on it loads of audiobooks that you can buy. Now, the deal is that if you click on the link in the description below here, or type in www.audible.com/Lindybeige, then this will take you to an offer on the audible.com site, which is 1 month's free membership of the site and 1 free credit, which you can spend on a book. And that book is yours to keep forever. It's free, and you don't have to read it or listen to it within the month's membership. It's yours forever, honest. And you know that I quite like war memoirs. Of course, audible.com has loads of books on all sorts of topics. They don't just do war memoirs, but I admit that the book I'm enjoying at the moment is one called Dadland by Kegi Carew, and it's an interesting book. It's very, very nicely written, and the audio version of it is read by not just one person but 4, which is actually rather nice. It sort of adds to it. Her investigation into her father's past. Her father had an extremely interesting war, He was one of the Jedburghs. He was parachuted into France in 1944 in uniform. Yeah, to organise the French resistance against the Germans. The idea of the in uniform bit was that, you know, even though you're a secret agent parachuting behind enemy lines, if you arrive in uniform, it'll be a tremendous boost to the morale of the French to see that the British have sent them someone in uniform. So you can say, right, now you French resistance, could you all just stop fighting each other for a while and we can fight the Germans? What do you say to that? Oh, and I've brought a load of Sten guns and Bren guns, which are actually quite good, you know, for you to use, and we got explosives for blowing up trains and so forth. So that's what he did for a while, and then later he went into Burma and did the same job there. Though admittedly, actually, I haven't got that far in the book yet, so I don't know exactly what happens. But I met Kegi Karoo at the Wigtown Book Festival, which explains, for instance, what that giant golden pencil is. Yes, I know that some of you are wondering, what's that giant golden pencil doing behind him? Well, that, ladies and gentlemen, is the golden pencil of... I'm pointing in the wrong direction. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the golden pencil of Wigtown, which I won for my performance of one of my poems, which you may have seen. I performed for the first time in public a recitation of An Incomplete Life, which I thought was a bit of a sad poem to win a talent contest, but I cheered them up a bit with a few limericks, and I got the golden pencil, which is now mine forever. Yes, I was there to talk about Hannibal and comic books and so forth, and it was a very pleasant... it's the second biggest book festival in Scotland, you know. Oh, yes, and you can't say that lightly. Now, so back to audible.com. Yes, so if you type in www.audible.com/Lindybeige, you can get that free offer, and then you can listen to a free thing. The book that I'm listening to is over 13 hours long, so you can listen to it under all sorts of circumstances, and they're particularly set up for being listened to on mobile phones. So you're walking to work or sitting on the tube train or whatever it is that you do and need a bit of entertainment, well, that's something that you can do. Oh, and then it's now compatible with Generation 4 Apple Television. I have no idea what that means, but if you don't have fourth generation Apple Television, then it doesn't matter, and if you do, then you probably do know what it means, in which case that'll be good. Okay, so now back to tanks and that. So, is the three-man turret definitely better than the one-man turret? I talked about the advantages of the one-man turret. Obviously, with the disadvantages of the three-man turret. You have to make the turret much bigger, so it's easier to see, easier to hit, harder to armour, it's heavier, and if it does get hit, you've got three men who might get killed, and you've got more men who get made useless if their weapon gets knocked out. So here's the thing, we don't actually know for certain, because the one-man turret never went up against the three-man turret in exactly equal circumstances. In the case of the Blitzkrieg, the Germans usually massively outnumbered what few French tanks there were with their one-man turrets, so that's not really a fair comparison. But I would say that yes, the three-man turret was worth it, partly for the reasons that I've already, I think, described. If you think about actually having to use one of these weapons in the field and try to command and communicate with the other people in the field whilst doing all those things, a three-man turret could have a well-drilled team and get loads of shells off quickly and on target, and the first tank to get a shell off quick, on target usually wins. So that would be a good thing. So the advantage of a three-man turret is quite palpable. But my biggest bit of evidence is simply that that's what everyone ended up doing. The late war tanks, the Panthers and the Tigers and so forth of the Germans, the T-34-85s if you're Russian, and the Shermans and Cromwells and Churchills if you're British, and the American equivalents, they all went over to the three-man turret. So clearly, military thinkers of the day thought, yeah, it really is worth having a three-man turret. It's a better way of doing things. And the one-man turret, though they still exist today, they're small turrets that are added onto armoured personnel carriers and so forth. In what you today might call a main battle tank, something like a Challenger, you don't have the one-man turret. So there you go. There's my conclusion. Yes, the three-man turret is better, and the one-man turret probably was a mistake.